Hi, welcome everyone to this Impact Week session, Defining Diversity with Dr. Miguel Unzueta. We are so grateful to have you all here. My name is Miranda Thang, President of Net Impact, and I'm honored to provide a brief introduction for this special event, which will explore how diversity is defined in the workplace and how leaders of organizations can build and support a diverse workforce. This event has been organized as part of UCLA Anderson's Impact Week, an annual conference that celebrates our community's commitment to creating a more equitable, just, and sustainable society. Impact Week is organized by UCLA Anderson's Impact at Anderson Center and the Net Impact MBA chapter, in collaboration with partners within the business school and across the broader UCLA community. As a public and land-grant institution, it is important for UCLA to acknowledge that our campus resides on what was historically the homeland of Indigenous peoples who were dispossessed of their land. Before we begin our session today, we would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Miguel Unzueta, Senior Associate Dean of MBA Programs and Professor of Management and Organizations at Anderson. Dean Unzueta studies diversity, bias, and discrimination. His latest research explores the manner in which people and companies define diversity and the impact that contemporary diversity definitions have on the representation of women and racial minorities in organizations. Dean Unzueta has been awarded the George Robbins Teaching Award for Excellence in the Classroom and the Faculty Community Engagement Award for exemplifying service to the school through his engagement with students and alumni. We're so excited to have him with us today. Before I hand it off, I want to note that you can submit questions via the Q&A box in our conference platform. Thank you again for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Unzueta.
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to talk about some of my research that I've been doing pretty much my whole time I've been at UCLA Anderson, which I started in 2006. So I've been doing this work for a little while. Before I get started, though, I just wanted to acknowledge yesterday's important historic verdict in the George Floyd murder trial. I hope everybody's doing okay. I know I had a sort of unexpected reaction. I thought I was going to experience joy after the conviction came in, but if anything, I just got sad all over again, kind of rethinking and reliving last Memorial Day and last summer. So I just wanted to say that to acknowledge the event, and I hope y'all are taking care of yourself and that you're taking the time to process and really think about what this means for the future of our society. So anyway, I'm happy to talk offline with anybody if you are so inclined. Just feel free to reach out. I'm easy to find on the Anderson website. Okay, let me switch over to my presentation. What I'm going to be doing today is, this is actually a research talk that I've given at a few universities that have invited me out there to speak. It's funny, the last real world in-person presentation I gave was a version of this talk at the Kennedy School. So it's a little weird to be going back to this. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, I'm a social psychologist by training. And so what I do is I run experiments and surveys. And normally when we write papers, our papers are composed of anywhere from 3 to 10 studies. So what I'm going to do today is show you couple of studies from a bunch of different papers that I hope make a convincing point about the subjective nature of how people understand diversity, and also what I think are some interesting patterns in the way members of majority versus minority groups think about diversity, and of course the consequences of that. I'm going to start off with a line graph from, this is not my research, this is actually research done by a team of sociologists. And what these sociologists did is they actually tracked the evolution of diversity rhetoric throughout time. So diversity rhetoric comes into public discourse in the late 1970s. The famous Bakke versus UC Regents decision in that Supreme Court decision, it was ruled that it is a compelling state interest for universities to want to maintain diversity in their classes. So that decision is actually credited with being the first time that diversity, as a way to refer to demographic representation and by extension, to start thinking about equity related concepts, that's when the term comes into use. What ends up happening though is that diversity as a concept morphs throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the present day. And so what you're seeing up here on this slide, these lines, what these authors did is they actually tracked the prevalence of the use of the word diversity in business publication articles, things like Harvard Business Review, the MIT Sloan magazine. These are magazines and articles geared for practitioners and managers. And so what they were looking at is when these articles or when these journals talk about diversity, how are they talking about it? What is the type of diversity that these journals are referring? And so what you see is the solid black line and also the dotted black line. These are the number of articles that talk about diversity with reference to either civil rights rhetoric or equal employment civil rights, right? It's kind of diversity in the way a lot of us think of it, which is you use diversity rhetoric to talk about issues related to gender representation, racial representation, and other protected categories. The white line represents the use of the word diversity in these articles with no reference whatsoever to civil rights or legally protected categories. This would be things like talking about diversity of thought or diversity of functional expertise as being something useful for organizations to capitalize on, to be more creative, to generate more profit, et cetera. And so what these authors found is that this sort of acontextual, or certainly this broadened conception of diversity, really picks up in the late 1980s into the 90s. And what we're seeing is a drop of the use of diversity as a way to talk about issues related to civil rights and to protected categories, and now more so as this broader umbrella term that refers to variance of all kinds. And so I find this finding really interesting because, just to give you an anecdote of mine, I initially got this idea to study the late conception of diversity when I was in graduate school. I was in graduate school at Stanford from 2001 to 2006. I was in the business PhD program up there in organizational behavior. There were about 90 doctoral students, and there were 2 of us that identified as underrepresented minorities. Yet the business school's PhD program loved calling itself diverse. And so I just kept wondering, like, what are they talking about? Like, it's just me and Larry. Like, what are you talking about? You're diverse. And it turns out they were talking about the fact that you can get a PhD in accounting or OB or finance or econ. They were talking about the fact that, they had people from all over the world. They had people that graduated from Harvard and Stanford and Arizona. They were talking about diversity very broadly defined as all sorts of differences between those of us that were in the program. And that's what they were using to call the place diverse, which was really interesting because when I used the term diverse, I would use it to talk about underrepresentation specifically of racial minorities. Yet there was a disconnect there. And I would argue that the way the business school was using the term very broadly is what this white line represents, which has been this growing trend towards defining diversity or talking about diversity in ways that have nothing to do with equity or the representation of groups that have historically been discriminated against or straight up kept out of certain companies. So these authors have argued that diversity rhetoric has evolved from referring specifically to civil rights concepts to a contemporary term that includes a broad range of dimensions not protected by law. Some of these newer dimensions that are now being included under the umbrella of diversity are things like people's professions, social class, lifestyle, thinking style, personality, et cetera. And this is not to say that diversity on these dimensions doesn't matter. It's simply to say that the concept of diversity has become diluted in that it has become so broad that you could be, when you say you're talking about diversity, you could be talking about race, you could be talking about gender, you could be talking about whether or not you have left-handers in your group. So it's a very unspecific, and I would argue a very problematic term to be using to talk about issues of equity and representation amongst dimensions that have been historically targeted for discrimination. And just to give you a couple of examples of what I view as this broadening of diversity out there in the world, this was a headline from a Toronto newspaper. The headline was, "Have your say, should workplace diversity include ex-cons and body piercings?" Again, I just point this out to show how different the use of the term is now versus what it was when the term originally came into public discourse, which was a way to talk about civil rights related concepts, groups that were legally protected. And then here's one from close to home, our very own Twitter account. First day of classes, this is in 2016. The school was bragging about how diverse our incoming MBA class was. And what they were talking about is the fact that there are 156 different undergraduate institutions represented. No mention of underrepresented minority percentages or the percent of women. I have to go back and look at the numbers, but I'm guessing that we would look a lot less diverse if we were talking about URM status and women in the class than if we were about 156 undergraduate institutions. So just a couple of examples. So there's this other work, again, also by sociologists, that find that people tend to define diversity in very broad ways. So this work by Bell and Hartman was qualitative research in which they interviewed subjects about their reactions and thoughts about what diversity is. There was a couple of really interesting findings in this work. The first is that they found that, like this broadened definition of diversity that I was just talking about, regular people also define diversity very broadly. When you ask them, what do you think about when you think of diversity? They say, oh, I think about racial diversity, also religious and parenting style, age, long list of categories, similar to this broadening of the concept. The other really interesting term is that when you ask people, well, what do you think about diversity? In the abstract, people react positively. They go, oh, it's the spice of life. It's great. Diversity is amazing. When you ask them for specific experiences with diversity, people start becoming a little more guarded and a lot more negative. They say, well, in fact, oh, the last time I had a quote unquote diverse experience was this awkward interaction with a member of a different racial group in which I maybe said the wrong thing. Or people start talking about sort of things that were maybe a little more uncomfortable than diversity being the spice of life. So it's just kind of interesting that people react positively in the abstract, but are more negative when they get concrete. And they also define diversity very broadly. Now getting to some of my own research, along with a former PhD student here at UCLA, Kevin Binning, we were interested in seeing what would happen if you ask members of racial minority groups to what extent their own group was associated with diversity. We thought that we might see agreement there if we really focus people in terms of thinking about diversity specifically in racial terms, but what we found was not that at all. So I'll show you on the next slide. So we surveyed self-identified white, Black, Latino, and Asian participants. This is back in, I think this is an on-campus survey done in like 2008 or 9. And so these were primarily UCLA staff members and also undergraduates at the university. We asked them to what extent particular racial groups were associated in their minds with diversity. And what we find, I'm going to focus first on the Black, Latino, and Asian data. What you find is this interesting pattern where there is a significant in-group bias such that Black subjects associate their own group the most with diversity. Latino subjects, same thing. They associate Latinos primarily with diversity. And our self-identified Asian subjects do the same thing as well. They actually associate themselves more so with diversity than other groups. The only category for which there was agreement was the low association of whites with the concept of diversity. And that's even the pattern for our white subjects. So it was an interesting finding, we thought, such that there is, even when you're focusing people in on racial diversity, there's still disagreement. And basically what we're finding is that for racial minority subjects, diversity is, are there people like me here, right? So is my group represented? And if it is, that's what's considered diverse. And I'll show you, this finding comes back later in a later paper, and I'll show you how that manifests and also why that's important. So this is more evidence of subjectivity in diversity perceptions. So given this, the broader idea I'm trying to argue is that diversity is this murky, ambiguous concept, at least in the present day, right? The umbrella's been broadened to include all sorts of categories: race, gender, thinking patterns, personality, where you went to undergrad, et cetera. So it can refer to all sorts of things. And so given this, it's quite possible, this is me, the psychologist, social psychologist now speaking, given this ambiguity, it's not quite possible that people's perceptions of diversity could be influenced by underlying psychological motivations. And this is kind of the flavor of most of the work that I do. I'm really interested in how people define complex concepts in ways that they think they're being objective, but in reality, they're being motivated by underlying psychological reasons. And so let me get into that. So in this, it's not a paper, but in this line of work, I argue that you can think of diversity as being defined in ways that are either hard to achieve or easy to achieve. And I also predict that you're going to define diversity in ways that are hard to achieve if you are motivated to create diversity, to create change that benefits your group. You'll be motivated to define diversity in ways that are easy to achieve if you're not all that interested in really changing systems, and if that tends to benefit your own particular in-group. So broadly speaking, I'm speaking with a broad brush, but this is what the data suggests from now decades of research. The social status of the groups that you belong to tends to impact your attitudes towards inequality generally. Most minority groups, so groups that are lower in status in whatever hierarchy we're talking about, they tend to be motivated to attenuate these hierarchies. So basically, if you're at the bottom or near the bottom of a social hierarchy, you belong to a group that's lower in status, you tend to be more motivated to try to eradicate that to create more equality, meaning you're actually more interested in creating systemic change. If you belong to a group on top, a majority group, a high status group, you tend to be more motivated to either maintain that hierarchy or actually increase it. So if you apply this to race relations, what you find is that members of low status racial minorities, Latinos, African Americans, for example, tend to be more motivated to create equality in society. White Americans, members of majority groups, tend to be more motivated in maintaining the status quo, or at least not changing things too much to maintain structural advantages that benefit them. And these desires don't get manifested so concretely, but we know from research on this topic that people's attitudes, support for particular presidential candidates, all of these things, even though they may not be coded in this, it's benefiting or attenuating the hierarchy sort of way, the patterns are there. You tend to find that majority groups tend to favor, for example, political candidates that are anti-egalitarian, and minority group members tend to, in general, favor political candidates that are more egalitarian in their political stances and policy proposals. So this motivation to impact the hierarchy may affect the way minority and majority groups think of diversity. And the reason why I argue this is the case is because when you say that a company or a university is quote unquote diverse, you're also saying that the company is fair, right? The processes for bringing people into your ranks are fair, and whatever demographic composition remains, it's the way it should be, right? And so that's what it means when you say a place is diverse, right? We've achieved it. We've achieved the mission. We're good. We're diverse. We can monitor the situation, but we've achieved a sense of fairness in the company here that is good. And so given what I just argued above, this tendency to want to motivate or affect hierarchies, what I argue then is that given the fact that diversity, at least in my perspective, means that the context is now the way it should be or is fair, What this might suggest is that minority groups might define diversity in ways that are harder to attain, because if you are forcing a university or a company to achieve a more difficult type of diversity, that is more likely to create change in the organization. On the other hand, majority group members, since they're more motivated to maintain the status quo as is, might be motivated to want to call companies or universities diverse as soon as possible. Because the second you say we're diverse, it means you're done and you can stop worrying about the demographic composition of the organization. I'm going to show you a bunch of studies that I argue reflect this hard versus easy conception of diversity. Let me show you my very first study. This is from a paper. And actually, I'm checking the questions real quick. There's a question about negotiations. I'll come to that at the end if I have time. It's a little bit outside the scope of what I'm talking about here today, but we can talk about that after. All right, let me show you. This is the first paper I published on perceptions of diversity. We surveyed self-identified white or Asian participants, and I exposed them to the demographics of a purportedly real organization, in which I told them that this organization had either high or low numbers of racial minorities in their ranks. And then on top of that, I also told them, by the way, these racial minorities are either well represented in the managerial ranks or primarily in the entry level of the organization. So I basically manipulate the overall representation, the sort of the raw number or percent of minorities in the company, and also where in the company's hierarchy these racial minorities are represented. And then what I'm asking people to do is tell me, do you think this company is diverse? And what this allows me to do is look and see if there are group-based differences in the things people pay attention to when determining whether or not a company is diverse or not. So that's why it's important that I'm surveying self-identified white and Asian participants. I'm going to show you the actuals. We gave them a description of a company. We told them this is a company. I believe we told them this is a solar company operating here in the United States. We give them a little bit of information about the company's financials. And then we tell them, by the way, here are the company's demographic composition. For the sake of interpretability, we told people this company was relatively small with only 100 employees. And then we told them, we randomly assigned people to one of four conditions. This condition is the low numerical representation of racial minorities and also low structural representation of minorities. So if you see, there's only 14 out of 100 of the employees are considered minority. And in this study, I lumped in Black, Latino, and Asian employees as a general minority group. I didn't tell them what percentage of these 14 were Black, Latino, or Asian. That's an issue with this study and this paper that I address in later studies. I'll get to that in a little bit. So this is low numbers, 14 out of 100. And then if you notice, only 2 of these 14 were in the higher levels of the company, the managerial rank. So this is low numbers, low structure. This is low numbers, high structure. Still only 14, but 6 of these 14 happen to be managers, right? That's what that 6 of 8 up here represents. And again, you're being randomly assigned to one of these 4 conditions. This is high numbers, low structure. So now it goes from 14 to 28 racial minorities out of 100. However, only 4 happen to be in the managerial ranks. And then this is high numbers, high structure, 28 out of 100, and 12 happen to be in the managerial ranks. So you're randomly assigned to one of 4. Afterwards, we ask people, do you think this company is diverse? And so these were the variables that we actually exposed them to. Perceptions of diversity. Do you think this company, which was, we called it Strathmore, do you think it's diverse? We take an average of these items to create the perceived diversity variable. We also asked them whether or not you think this company should be implementing policies that promote diversity to get at sort of the attitudinal consequences of seeing or not seeing diversity. Let me show you the actual results. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the results. This is our self-reported Asian participants. This is how they responded to to these questions of perceived diversity. Basically, what you see here is that the only condition that evoked relatively high numbers or relatively high perceptions of diversity was the high number, high structure condition. So this suggests that for our Asian respondents, they thought a company was diverse when there were relatively high numbers of racial minorities present, and also a good percentage of them were in the managerial ranks. Anything else did not evoke this kind of response, right? You needed both of these things to be present, high numbers and high structure, in order for the company to be considered diverse. Interestingly, our white subjects define diversity in ways that I argue are easier to achieve. They were primarily influenced by the overall percentage representation of racial minorities, irrespective of how many of them were in the managerial ranks. So they were more swayed by 28 versus 14, and they paid less attention to, well, what percentage of these folks are actually managers? They were not paying attention to the structural representation of racial minorities. We also asked your diversity policy support. What you're going to see here is a mirror pattern of what I showed you on the previous slide. Basically, our Asian subjects say this company should be implementing diversity policies in every condition except, or they're lower anyway, in the high numbers, high structure condition. So when they don't see diversity, they see the need for policies going up. When they do see diversity, they actually lower their support for policies. Same pattern emerges for our white subjects. When they think diversity is present, that is the yellow bars, they actually say that they support diversity policies less. It's when they don't see diversity in the low number condition where they actually up their support for diversity policies at this company. You can do a mediation analysis. What this suggests is that basically the more diversity you see, the less diversity policy support you endorse. So I would argue this is a very important consequence of this perception of diversity, right? If you are employing a definition of diversity that's easy to achieve or easy to see because maybe you're paying attention to only the raw numbers of minorities, irrespective of where in the company's ranks they're being employed, or if you're defining diversity, say, as where all of us went to undergrad versus how many of us are members of underrepresented groups, you're going to see more diversity. And the more diversity you see, the less you think it's important to have policies that monitor this. So that's sort of the concrete importance of this. Mediation, get to that. This is a summary of the first study. Our self-identified Asian subjects saw as diverse only an organization characterized by both high numbers and high structure of underrepresented group members. I would argue this is a hard or harder definition of diversity to achieve, right? It's 2 ingredients versus only 1 ingredient. Our self-identified white subjects saw the organization as diverse when there were high numbers present. There was no effect of structural representation, meaning they employed an easier definition of diversity. I would argue that it's easier to see high numbers than to see high representation in the managerial ranks. And also this is a 1 ingredient versus a 2 ingredient definition of diversity. Let me look at the questions real quick here. Yeah, so what's the appropriate term to use instead of diversity when referring to people from different demographic dimensions, asked by Jessica. I'm actually going to get to that at the end. I mean, one thing that I press for when I'm giving this talk to corporate audiences, or frankly to other researchers who are just very applied, I always ask them to be very specific about what they're talking about, right? So it's a lot easier for us to sit back and talk about diversity and how we need to improve diversity, say at the Anderson School. It's a lot more difficult to talk specifically about, okay, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the percent of Latinx MBA students in the full-time program? If so, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what's happening in that program that might be leading to a systemic underrepresentation of this particular group in this particular program relative to other parts of the school. So it's a lot more difficult to talk about these very specific dimensions of inequality, yet I think it's incredibly important to do so. I would argue that when people engage in unspecific diversity talk. What they're really trying to do is engage in a euphemistic conversation about very difficult subject matters. And if you don't take the time to define what specifically we're talking about, what underrepresentation you're trying to impact or address, if you're not doing that, you're not going to get very concrete about figuring out solutions. You're just going to end up with people thinking they're talking about something important, but as my work suggests, is your dimension of diversity might be different than what I'm thinking about, right? You might be talking about the fact that we don't have enough people that went to undergrad in Florida. I'm talking about the fact that we have very few Black faculty in the latter faculty at Anderson, right? So I think it's very important to be very specific about what it is you're talking about. And one way to do that is to specifically just say, I'm talking about race in this particular part of the organization, and go from there. I'll get more to that a little bit later. All right, I talked about study one. Let me show you study two. This is a different paper that I wrote with a couple of collaborators. One was at the University of Washington, the other was at the University of Virginia. In this study, we were really interested in exploring what happens to people's perceptions of diversity when there are minorities present, but it's not your group that's present, right? So if I am Asian American and I'm looking at a group that's Black and white, there are minorities there, right? There's African Americans in the group, but do you actually think that group is diverse when your group is not there? And if you sort of think back to the first study I showed you with those bar graphs based on racial group, this is what this study is picking up on, that pattern we found in that early study. And they were also curious if white Americans differentiate between the types of minority groups that are present. Are they paying attention to certain groups that are there versus not? So this was a study run at the University of Washington. These were all upper division business majors, juniors and seniors at UW. We exposed them to one of two groups, randomly assigned to either a group that was composed of Black and white employees or a group that was composed of Asian or white employees. These subjects, like in the study I showed you, were all self-identified white or Asian respondents, and we asked them, how diverse do you think this group is? So let me show you the conditions. This is what the Black and white team look like. So you get a little description of the company, the team, what the team does. And by the way, here's a picture of the team. Now we're going to ask you some questions. And then one of the questions was, do you think this team is diverse? This is the Black and white team. This was the Asian and white team. All of these faces were pre-tested to make sure that people could categorize them into the racial groups that we think they're representing. And we also made sure that they were in perceived equality of attractiveness to not introduce that as a confounding variable in our study. So the dependent variable was, do you think these particular groups are diverse? So this is the data for our self-identified Asian respondents. When we asked them, okay, do you think these groups are diverse? Those assigned to the Asian white group think that group is more diverse than the Black white group. Again, think back to the study I showed you at the very start of my talk, which referred to minority groups thinking that diversity is primarily associated with their own group. This is what's happening here, right? It's like, well, the group can have Black and white Americans in it, but if it doesn't have my in-group, I don't call it diverse. So it suggests that at least for these respondents, they're defining diversity as, are there people like me present? Interestingly enough, and this was replicated throughout the paper in multiple studies, our white subjects were not sensitive to that. For them, we had other studies that had a condition that was all white and nobody thought that group was diverse. But our white subjects don't differentiate between the groups that are present. Basically, our white respondents are looking for, are there people not like me present? And if the answer is yes, then I think this group is diverse. So that was the results here. So basically, white Americans are not differentiating between the specific minority groups that are present within these groups. I argue, this suggests they're defining diversity as, are there people not like me present? And again, if all you're looking for are people who are not like you, that's going to be easier to find than looking for specific groups that might be present, right? So I would argue that for the majority group, this is an easy definition of diversity, in that you're looking for people not like me. On the other side, our minority perceivers, in this case, Asian respondents, they're very sensitive to in-group representation. And we replicated this finding, by the way, with African Americans and also with Latinos. I'm just showing you the data for the study in which we surveyed self-identified Asian respondents. So our minority perceivers are defining diversity as, are there people like me present? If there are other groups there, but they're not my in-group, then I don't consider this company to be diverse. I would argue that's a hard or harder definition of diversity, because now you're looking specifically for people that belong to your group in saying that this company or this group is diverse or not diverse. So that was study 2. I'm going to show you some newer, actually, let me look at the questions real quick. There's a good question about sort of European perceptions. I'll get to that at the end. That's a good one. Hey, there's a question about Anderson defining itself as diverse, but then internally you get our numbers, and not so great. So yeah, I mean, on that, I think that's a great example of the importance of, when you're talking about diversity or the lack of diversity, it's very important to have specific categories in what parts of the organization, and also having data to back it up. I've been doing this for years. I've been showing people the demographics of the latter faculty at Anderson. There are 2, as of right now, out of about 90 latter faculty, there are 2 faculty members who identify as underrepresented minorities. It's myself and it's Al Osborne, out of 90. And people are shocked. Even my own colleagues are shocked to realize that. And so I think it's really important to come at people with data to make sure that they are focused on the dimension that you think is important and that the university should be trying to address. Without that, you're just going to end up with people defining diversity in ways that are convenient, that are going to allow them to see diversity when maybe it's not there. And I think it also speaks to the importance of shifting the way we talk about these issues to not talking about diversity generally, but talking about the specific processes that might be keeping out perfectly qualified PhD candidates from getting jobs at Anderson, who happen to not be in particular networks that you could argue are racially homogenous versus not. So I think specificity is key. Let me show you the results from the last paper that we published. This paper came out, I guess it's now been a year and change, 2019. This is a paper I wrote with Felix Danbold, who's a former PhD student at UCLA. He's now a professor at the London School of Economics. We were interested in figuring out at what percentage of racial minorities do organizations go from being not diverse to diverse in people's eyes? And also, are there differences in where people draw that line? So we're sort of trying to get a little bit more stringent in testing the idea that diversity is subjectively defined. In this case, we've decided we're just going to ask people, what percentage do you need to see in order for this company to be considered diverse? And we specifically told them, we're talking about diversity with regards to race or gender. I'll show you a gender study. And just tell us, what percentage do you need to see for this company to be diverse? We thought that was going to be a conservative test of our idea. And what we actually found was, again, this very predictable group-based difference based on the social status of the groups that we're talking about. So basically, I'm just showing you one of the items that we used. It was a 7-point scale. And the item was, this company is diverse enough. If you answered above neither agree nor disagree, basically above a 4, we're considering that as you saying this company is in fact diverse, right? If you go over 4 in a 7-point scale, anything below a 4 would be considered not diverse. All right. We had some interesting, I think, cool methods that I'll show you that are a little bit different than the more traditional experiments that I showed you in the first couple studies. So this is what we were predicting. So along the x-axis down here, you see the percent of minority group members present. And so that percent goes from 0 to 100, obviously. And this line that you see here on the, I guess that's the left side of your screen. I'm a little turned around. The one that says non-dominant group minority threshold, that's the line, right? If you notice, that line is meeting up against the 4 on the y-axis. So basically, when you cross that percentage, that's when people are going to start saying this company is diverse, meaning they are responding to our item that I just showed you above a 4 on the scale. So we're really interested in seeing if there's a difference in where that threshold is drawn. This is sort of the theoretical model that we put out in this paper. So the predictions that we were asking, or that we made here, is that the majority group members might be quicker to call an organization diverse, in that they might require a lower percentage of minority group members present in order to call this company diverse. Basically, they might cross 4 on that 7-point Likert scale sooner than racial minorities. Again, I would argue this is consistent with the idea that members of majority groups are defining diversity in ways that are easier to achieve. In this case, a lower percentage of minority group members present. The minority, on the other hand, may withhold their assessment of this company's diversity. That is, they might require a larger percentage of minority groups to be present. I would argue this is a hard or harder definition of diversity. So let me show you the study. We had over 1,000 subjects, self-identified white, or in this case, African-American subjects. We randomly exposed them to one of 20 different conditions in which we manipulate the demographic composition of a company. And then we ask them these items about the company's perceptions of diversity. How diverse do you think the company is? We found some interesting findings on these sufficient diversity items that I'll get to in just a little bit, relative to the descriptive diversity items, which I just showed you in the previous studies. So this is an example of one of the conditions. It was a much more complex design. It had 20 conditions, not 4, like some of the other studies I showed you. And basically, we exposed people to a company. We told them this company is either, in this case, 70% white, 30% black. There was a condition that was 75% white, 25% black, 80% white, 20% black. Basically goes from 0, 100 to 100, 0, 20 different permutations. You're randomly assigned to that. And then we ask people, is this company diverse? There's some issues with artificiality that are happening here that I'll hopefully address in subsequent studies that I will show you before we're done. This was the 15%, 85% demographic condition. So this, a lot of data, 20 conditions, a lot of bars. What you'll start noticing though, red bars represent our self-identified white subjects, blue bars represent our black subjects. And what you start seeing is that the red bars on at least the end of the scale that's below 50 seem to be higher than the blue bars, which represent our African-American subjects. There's a much cleaner way to look at these data. I'll show you what we did in terms of curving these results. This is when the question about, is this company diverse enough? A more prescriptive perception of diversity item. You see the pattern emerge a lot more cleanly, right? You see the red bars for our white subjects higher than the blue ones. Again, what this is representing is that our white subjects are seeing diversity before our black subjects are seeing diversity. To address whether or not there's underlying distributions here, we used Gaussian curves to try to figure out what's happening here. And this is where our results get a lot easier to interpret. What I'm going to show you is only the results for the item that is, this company is diverse enough, the prescriptive item. And what you see here, the finding that we thought was most important was this one. So you're finding that our white subjects say this company is diverse at about 24.4% African-American representation. African-Americans say, hold up, it's 36.6. That's the number of black employees you're going to need for us to call this company diverse. So there's about a 10 percentage point difference in where that diversity line is drawn. White subjects see diversity at lower percentages of minorities than do minorities. Again, I would argue this is getting back to the hard versus easy framework that I put out at the beginning of the study. This is an easier definition, right? You literally have to see less minority group members for white Americans to consider the company diverse, harder for African Americans. These differences are especially pronounced on this prescriptive assessment of diversity. And so this really got us thinking that some of our effects that I showed you in the first few studies, we were using the item that wasn't prescriptive, right? It didn't have that enough component to it. It was simply, is this company diverse? So we're actually thinking now that some of our previous effects might actually be underestimated because we were using this descriptive item, not the prescriptive one that we used in this particular study. Let me show you replication of the study. We're using gender in this one. We switched to gender. We were getting complaints being like, well, a black-white company is so unrealistic. Like, what kind of company is like that, is composed like that? And also a 95%, 5%, black-white company, that seems really like not common. So we were like, okay, fine. There might be some artificiality. We get it. So we switched our approach to using gender. Now I'm fully aware that gender is not a dichotomous category. However, most people still think of gender as being one of two categories. So we decided to capitalize on this general belief. And so now we're going to expose people to the male and female representation of a company. The prediction, we're expecting women to draw the gender diversity line later than men who are in the majority group or the higher status majority group. We're exposing subjects here to one random organization. We're giving them 5% intervals again, so 20 different conditions. This is the example of the 75% female, 25% male company. There was an 80-20, 85-15, et cetera, all the way from 0-100 to 100-0. I'm just going to get right to the results. These were the results, self-identified male and female subjects. What we're finding is that male subjects crossed the 4 on the diversity perception scale at about 25.4% female representation. Women say, no, this company can be considered diverse enough once we cross 35.5%. So again, about a 10 percentage point difference in how many women you need to see represented in order for this company to be seen as diverse enough. You're finding that the majority group, men, are seeing diversity sooner than women in this case. So it's a pattern from the previous study is replicated here. The dominant group is continuing to draw this diversity line sooner than the non-dominant group, in this case, the self-identified female group. And again, I would argue this is consistent with this easy versus hard definition, right? Men have an easier definition because they need lower percentages of minorities present. Women have the higher percentage, a harder definition to achieve. I'm going to show you one last study. The study actually had like 9 different studies, so I'm not going to show you every single study. It was kind of a monster of a paper that we wrote, but the upside is we replicated this effect like over a dozen times, and 9 of those studies ended up in the paper. So what I'm going to show you here is a study in which we try to replicate the previous 2 studies, except in this study, we're trying to assess people's sensitivity to the underlying base rate of minority group members present in a given context. So we figured that maybe if you tell people that, by the way, this company is in a state with very few racial minorities, maybe you'll see these diversity lines shift around based on the pipeline or the availability of potential employees. So in this study, we're going to go back to white, Black subjects. And here we expose people to one of 21 different demographic perceptions. We also randomly assign people to think that this company is either in a state with 1% African-American population or 37% African-American population. These numbers were based on real life states. So the 1% was, I believe, North Dakota, maybe South Dakota, one of the Dakotas, very few African-Americans in one of the Dakotas. The 37% was based on census data from the state of Mississippi, which has the highest percentage of African-American citizens in Mississippi. So again, we don't tell people the state, we just tell them this company is in a low base rate state or a high base rate state. This is the sort of uncurved data. Again, you're seeing the red lines superseding the blue lines. That was in the 1% condition. This was in the 37% condition. Let me just show you once we do the Gaussian transformation. I'm going to focus first on the red lines. So our white, I'm going to focus first on the blue lines. The blue lines are Black subjects. Basically, what you find is that Black subjects say that the company is diverse at about 32 to 34%. It's not a significant difference, and it's irrespective of the overall base rate of African Americans in the context that the company is situated in. So they're basically not being swayed by the way this state only has 1% Black employees versus 37% Black employees. Our white subjects, though, on the other hand, are much more sensitive to the base rate. So they're actually seeing diversity a lot sooner in the 1% African American state as opposed to the 37% African American state. And what we're arguing these patterns represent is that white Americans might be anchored on proportionality in assessing their perception of diversity. African Americans might be more focused on equality, sort of irrespective of the immediate environment. So again, if you're trying to define diversity based on a metric of equality that's insensitive to base rate, that's a harder definition of diversity to achieve than if you are being influenced by the underlying representation or base rate of minority groups in this given context. These are the actual results from the paper. Basically, what I want to show you here is that in the 1% Black citizen state, whites say the company is diverse at about 17% Black representation. In the 37% state, they say about 25%. African Americans show no difference. The 30.20 below the red box there, that's 1% Black subject response, 31.7 in the 37%. So no sensitivity to base rate for Black subjects. So the base rate impacted only the majority group's definition. The majority group draws their diversity line based on proportions. Again, I would argue this is an easier definition to achieve if you're paying attention to the proportionality, right? So it sort of allows you to, in a situation where there's simply no meaningful base rate present, to be like, well, we're better than 1%, we're all good, we're diverse, right? Whereas our African American subjects don't do that. They seem to be much more, they're less swayed, or they're not swayed by the underlying base rate, suggesting to us that they might be using diversity lines as a way to try to achieve a sense of equality of representation versus a more equitable representation within the organization. And I would argue that achieving equality is much harder than achieving proportionality. Quick summary of all the studies. This is how I'm sort of viewing these findings. The easy majority definition based on only percentage of employees, based on whether or not there are any sort of non-whites present. They have a lower percentage of minorities required to call the company diverse. And then this last study, they're basing their diversity judgments on proportionality. The harder minority definition, it's percent minority employees plus minority managers. Is my in-group present, not just any non-white group? Higher percentage of minorities in the company, and diversity judgments based on the concept of equality, not proportionality. These curve studies at the end were replicated with African Americans. We had studies in which we replicated with Asian Americans. We had Latino, Latinx studies, and the gender studies that we showed you. So we replicated with as many groups as we could access that are on this majority-minority hierarchy. So to conclude, and then I'll look at your many questions over here. An ever-expanding definition of diversity, this bigger umbrella for what is considered diversity, might make this concept appealing to people regardless of what their motivation is. Are they trying to maintain the status quo? Are they trying to change the status quo? Diversity rhetoric in all its unspecific glory could appeal to people who are trying to do both. So in a lot of ways, diversity rhetoric might not be very useful if what you're trying to do is create more equitable representation in organizations. Calling a company diverse, which I argued at the beginning of my talk, signals that the status quo is fair and is as it should be. And so majority group members thus seem to want to call companies diverse a lot sooner than minority group members. And I would argue that easy definitions of diversity allow the majority to do this. This is some of my other work and also work being done by others now. There is this very robust and reliable pattern that white Americans and men, if we're talking about gender dynamics, but basically these majority groups, they see more diversity out there in the world than do racial minorities and women. It's just a very robust main effect. And I would argue that that's happening probably because the majority group defines diversity in ways that are easier to achieve and therefore easier to see. And the more diversity they see, unfortunately, the less they think that diversity promoting policies should even be in place at all. On the flip side, minorities have the harder definition, and so that leads to miscommunication, I would argue. Implications. Since diversity's meaning is murky and shifts, I really call into question the wisdom of using unspecific diversity language to try to address inequality in contemporary organizations. I think any organization that's trying to have a sincere and honest conversation about its demographic representation and the access that it's giving to everybody in society who is qualified to work there, they need to be talking specifically about the categories that are being underrepresented. So if your organization can't answer simple questions like, we'll know we've achieved diversity when our demographic looks like this, this, and this, or in our context, diversity refers specifically to female engineers in the managerial ranks, right? If you can't get to that level of specificity, you're probably engaging in a more performative, unspecific diversity talk that might make you feel good in the short run and might look good on your webpage, but might not actually motivate any sort of systemic change because you're just kind of talking around the problem, not about it. So instead of this unspecific euphemistic diversity talk, what I would argue is that we need more direct conversations about these very uncomfortable equity issues. And there's been some writing now that has argued that we need to create, I think the concept of safe spaces is maybe getting a little played out, or it's being talked about in very kind of expansive ways. However, there are some scholars out there who argue that we need to create safe spaces in which people can talk openly about racial and gender inequality, and people can ask questions that they might think are considered uninformed or dumb questions. And we need to be able to engage in this kind of conversation with the aim of educating people about why this matters and why the absence of particular groups means that your demographic composition is not where it should be. And there is probably some kind of systemic issue at play that's keeping people out of the organization. So I would argue that's going to be a lot more useful. And it's interesting. I actually wrote this particular implication back in early 2020, before the sort of the modern day social movement motivated by George Floyd's killing. After that, everybody's talking about the importance of talking about these issues and also talking about systemic racism. So I was pleased that the conversation seemed to get more specific. I just hope that momentum remains and that people's willingness to engage in these uncomfortable conversations continues even after these types of stories have receded from the headlines that we see every day. So I'm basically at time. I just want to thank my collaborators who are all right here. So I'm actually at time. Miranda, I don't want to delay you guys. I'm happy to talk any more. There's a bunch of questions that I'm not going to be able to get to. If you want to engage, feel free to drop me an email. My email is just unzueta@ucla.edu, and I'm happy to chat either over email or set up a Zoom call, and we can we can talk some more about this. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Impact Week.